There's a claim spreading across social media right now, in videos and posts with titles almost identical to this one, that a full American ground invasion of Iran is already underway. Before we go any further, I want to tell you exactly what the evidence actually shows, because the real story here is genuinely alarming on its own terms, even without needing to exaggerate it or round up to the most dramatic possible conclusion. This isn't a story about a confirmed invasion that's already happened in the way the title might suggest at first glance. It's a story about how close this war has actually come to that exact threshold, told through paratroopers, warships, White House meetings, and a president who has spent 5 months refusing to rule it out entirely. Let's start with what actually is confirmed by real, verifiable reporting, because that's the foundation everything else in this video needs to be built on, rather than speculation or assumption. According to Reuters reporting from March 28, 2026, the Pentagon was preparing for weeks of ground operations in Iran, according to a Washington Post report citing U.S. officials. That reporting states the plans could involve raids by special operations forces alongside conventional infantry troops. Though whether President Trump would actually approve any of those specific plans remained genuinely uncertain, according to that same Post reporting. The Trump administration had already deployed U.S. Marines to the Middle East by that point, as the war stretched into its 5th week, and had separately been planning to send thousands of soldiers from the Army's 82nd Airborne Division to the region. Here's a hook worth sitting with right away, before we get into any of the specific details covered throughout the rest of this video. Weeks of planned ground operations is not the same thing as a confirmed ongoing invasion, but it's also not nothing at all, and understanding the real distance between careful military planning and an actual battlefield reality is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the moment a headline gets written, to maximize clicks instead of accuracy. Let's talk about the actual troop movements that back up that reporting, because these aren't hypothetical claims floating around without any supporting evidence behind them. According to a report from the New York Post, aerial footage documented a U.S. military exercise during Operation Epic Fury inside Iran on March 25th, and separate imagery showed paratroopers with the 82nd Airborne Division walking toward a C-17 Globemaster transport aircraft at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, on March 13th, preparing for deployment. That same reporting states thousands of U.S. Marines were being sent to the Middle East, specifically to conduct raids involving both special operations forces and conventional infantry troops, and that officials had, by that point, been discussing plans for sending troops into Iran for several weeks already. Think about what it actually means logistically for the 82nd Airborne Division specifically to be involved in this kind of planning. This isn't a garrison unit or a support formation. The 82nd Airborne is one of the United States military's premier rapid deployment combat forces. Historically, the unit called upon when Washington needs troops capable of establishing a foothold in hostile territory on extremely short notice. Its involvement in planning discussions for this specific conflict tells you the Pentagon wasn't simply considering a token, symbolic ground presence. It was actively preparing the kind of force genuinely capable of executing real combat operations on Iranian soil if that order ever came down. Here's a hook worth carrying forward. When one of the Army's most elite rapid deployment combat divisions starts loading onto transport aircraft specifically in connection with a war's planning cycle, that's the kind of signal that separates genuine military preparation from simple political theater. Let's talk about the naval buildup running in parallel with all of this, because it adds another concrete layer of evidence. According to reporting from News on Air, dated March 30th, 2026, the USS Tripoli, carrying 3,500 sailors and Marines, arrived in the Middle East according to U.S. Central Command. That same reporting states the chief of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, met with senior Israeli military officials that same period specifically to discuss the ongoing conflict with Iran and efforts to curb Tehran's weapons production. Think about what 3,500 sailors and Marines arriving aboard a single amphibious assault ship actually represents in terms of raw capability. That's not a symbolic show of force. That's a genuine amphibious strike package. The exact kind of force structure the Marine Corps has spent decades refining specifically for scenarios involving forced entry onto hostile or contested coastline. Positioning a ship carrying that many combat-capable personnel in the region isn't the behavior of an administration simply keeping its options theoretically open. It's the behavior of an administration making sure those options are physically present and ready the moment a decision actually gets made. There's an important operational detail worth understanding about what a ship like the USS Tripoli actually enables, that a simple troop count on its own doesn't fully capture. Amphibious assault ships of this class function essentially as smaller aircraft carriers specifically configured for launching Marine forces ashore, carrying not just personnel but also helicopters, landing craft, and, depending on a configuration, fixed-wing aircraft capable of providing close air support during exactly the kind of forced entry scenario a ground operation against Iranian coastal territory, including somewhere like Kharg Island, would actually require. That's precisely why a vessel like this arriving in theater carries so much more strategic weight than its raw troop numbers alone might suggest. It's not simply delivering personnel, it's delivering an entire self-contained capability specifically built around getting those personnel from ship to shore under hostile conditions, exactly the capability a large-scale conventional invasion of the mainland would never realistically rely on alone, but that a smaller targeted seizure of coastal or island territory absolutely could. Now, let's talk about what Iran itself has been saying about all of this, because Tehran's own rhetoric adds an important layer of context that shouldn't be overlooked when trying to understand the full picture here. According to that same news on-air reporting, Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, accused the United States of secretly planning a ground invasion, despite appearing to pursue diplomatic efforts to end the broader conflict at the same time. Ghalibaf stated that Iranian forces were ready to respond if U.S. troops entered the country, warning that they would be, in his words, set on fire, and pledging retaliation against regional partners as well. Here's a hook worth chewing on. When a country's own parliamentary speaker publicly accuses the United States of secretly planning a ground invasion, while diplomatic talks are technically still ongoing on a separate track, that tells you Iran's own leadership either genuinely believes an invasion is coming, or finds that specific accusation politically useful for rallying domestic support, regardless of whether it's actually true. Either read is revealing about how seriously this specific threat is being taken inside Iran itself. Let's talk about a separate, specific threat that emerged from Iran's political establishment around the same period, because it adds real weight to how seriously Tehran was treating this scenario long before the most recent escalation ever began. According to earlier reporting connected to this same broader crisis, Manouchehr Mottaki, Iran's foreign minister from 2005 to 2010, and a sitting member of parliament, said in a state media interview that if U.S. forces seized Iranian territory, Iran should storm a U.S. base through what he specifically described as a combined helicopter-borne and ground assault, and take American soldiers hostage. That's not vague, general deterrent rhetoric. That's a specific, named tactical concept, floated publicly by a former foreign minister, describing exactly how Iran might respond to an American ground incursion. Now let's address the specific claim that a limited invasion may have already begun months ago, because this is where the story requires genuine care and honesty rather than simply repeating a dramatic-sounding line pulled from a single reference source without any further scrutiny. According to Britannica's own detailed timeline of this war, a limited invasion began on March 17th, amid reports that a broader ground offensive was likely. That's a real citation from a serious reference source, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. But here's the honest complication worth understanding. That exact same date, March 17th, is also documented elsewhere in connection with a very different kind of event entirely. According to Wikipedia's detailed entry on the Strait of Hormuz campaign, on March 17th, U.S. Central Command announced it had employed multiple GBU-72 5,000-pound penetrator munitions on underground missile silos along the Iranian coastline near the strait, destroying bunkers, storing Iran's cruise missiles and unused anti-ship missiles. That's an airstrike using a bunker buster bomb, not a ground invasion involving troops physically entering Iranian territory. And that same March 17th date also marks something else entirely, according to Britannica's own broader timeline, the killing of a senior Iranian official named Larijani, who was subsequently replaced by Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar in a move that reflected the growing dominance of the Revolutionary Guard Corps over Iran's political and clerical establishment during this specific period of the war. Here's a hook worth sitting with. When three genuinely significant events, a major airstrike, a senior assassination, and a reference to a limited invasion, all get dated to the exact same single day within the same broader historical account, that's exactly the kind of situation that calls for careful, honest verification rather than simply picking whichever interpretation sounds the most dramatic for a headline. Let's be completely transparent about what this means for how to responsibly answer the question this entire video is built around. It's genuinely possible that Britannica's reference to a limited invasion beginning March 17th refers to a real, distinct ground operation that simply isn't as widely documented in other available reporting. It's also entirely possible that reference reflects some overlap or conflation with the bunker buster strikes and leadership targeting that occurred on that exact same date. Responsible reporting on an active, fast-moving war means acknowledging that kind of genuine uncertainty directly, rather than confidently asserting one interpretation as settled fact, simply because it makes for a more compelling narrative. Think about why this kind of ambiguity is so common in real-time coverage of an active war, because it's worth understanding, rather than simply treating as a frustrating obstacle to a clean narrative. Wars generate an enormous volume of simultaneous, overlapping events, strikes, political announcements, leadership changes, troop movements, all happening within the same compressed time frame. often reported by different outlets using different terminology, different levels of confirmation, and different editorial priorities about what counts as noteworthy. A term like invasion carries an extremely specific, weighty meaning in military and historical usage, typically implying organized ground forces crossing into and occupying hostile territory. When a reference source uses that exact term for an event on the same date as a confirmed airstrike, without providing additional corroborating detail elsewhere, the responsible move is to flag that discrepancy openly rather than simply amplifying whichever version of events sounds most dramatic. That's precisely the standard this entire video is trying to hold itself to, because the temptation in covering a story like this one is obvious. A headline claiming an invasion has already begun generates far more attention than a headline carefully explaining that the situation remains genuinely uncertain and contested even among serious professional sources. But accuracy matters considerably more than excitement when the subject is something this consequential, and getting it wrong in either direction, either dismissing a real invasion as mere rhetoric or claiming a confirmed invasion when the actual evidence remains genuinely ambiguous, does a real disservice to anyone trying to actually understand where this war stands. Now, let's fast forward to the most recent phase of this war, because the ground invasion question has resurfaced with genuinely renewed intensity in just the past few weeks of reporting, well beyond anything discussed back in the spring. According to reporting from the World Socialist website, published July 21st, the rapid escalation of the Iran war and the mounting death toll for U.S. troops triggered a genuine crisis for the administration, which faces the failure of its stated goals of overthrowing the Iranian government, breaking the power of its military, and securing American domination of the Strait of Hormuz. That same reporting states the administration was moving more openly toward the deployment of ground troops, and that retired Lieutenant General Frank McKenzie, who ran U.S. military operations across the entire Middle East from 2019 to 2022, publicly advocated for a ground invasion of Kharg Island on CBS's Face the Nation program, stating directly that this was something the United States should think about doing because possession of Iranian soil would be a significant factor in future negotiations with Iran. Here's a hook worth carrying into the next stretch of this story. When a retired four-star general who personally ran the entire Middle East theater of operations for 3 years starts publicly advocating for seizing Iranian territory on national television, that's a genuinely different category of signal than anonymous administration sourcing or diplomatic posturing. That's someone with direct operational credibility making the case that holding actual Iranian ground has become a legitimate, serious option worth considering. Let's talk about the actual force disparity involved here, because it puts McKenzie's specific proposal into proper strategic perspective. That same World Socialist website reporting cites the International Institute for Strategic Studies, which estimates Iran fields roughly 570,000 active duty troops and 350,000 reserves, backed by coastal missile batteries, naval mines, and swarms of fast attack boats. Separately, retired General Philip Breedlove told Fox News that the 2003 invasion of Iraq required more than 300,000 U.S. troops staged in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, while the current American force in the broader region numbered only around 50,000 personnel, with relatively few of those actually being ground troops. Think about that specific comparison for a moment, because the math here is genuinely stark. Iran's own active and reserve forces alone total roughly 920,000 personnel. The entire American military presence across the whole region, as of that reporting, sat at only about 50,000, a small fraction of what a serious analyst like Breedlove says the 2003 Iraq invasion actually required just to conquer a considerably smaller and, at that specific moment in history, more militarily degraded country. That gap alone tells you why so many experienced military voices remain genuinely skeptical that a large-scale conventional ground invasion, in the traditional sense most people probably picture when they hear that phrase, is actually operationally realistic right now, regardless of how seriously the option is being discussed at the political level. Let's dig a little deeper into why that specific comparison to the 2003 Iraq invasion matters so much, because the differences between these two scenarios cut in multiple directions simultaneously, not just one. Iraq in 2003 had already been substantially weakened by more than a decade of sanctions, no-fly zone enforcement, and periodic American and British airstrikes, yet still required over 300,000 troops to conquer and occupy. Iran in 2026, despite having absorbed months of sustained American and Israeli airstrikes degrading its air defenses, missile production, and command infrastructure, still retains a vastly larger population base and a considerably larger raw troop count than Iraq ever fielded, even accounting for whatever portion of that force has already been degraded by this specific war. That's precisely the strategic puzzle facing anyone actually planning a potential ground operation. The air campaign has demonstrably crippled specific Iranian capabilities, missile production, air defense networks, naval assets, But raw manpower is a fundamentally different kind of resource than precision-guided munitions can efficiently eliminate at scale, which means any ground force attempting to operate inside Iran would still be facing a country with a population and troop base considerably larger than anything American forces have directly occupied in living memory. Here's a hook worth sitting with. The forces genuinely available for a ground operation right now look considerably more consistent with the kind of targeted raids and limited seizures Mackenzie specifically proposed for Kharg Island than with anything resembling a full-scale occupation of a country, fielding nearly 1 million total troops of its own. That's exactly why Mackenzie's own specific proposal, seizing Kharg Island rather than attempting anything resembling a full invasion, makes considerably more strategic sense once you actually sit with these numbers. Kharg Island, as covered extensively elsewhere in coverage of this war, handles the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, meaning it represents a target where even a relatively small, contained force could achieve enormous strategic leverage without needing anything close to the manpower a full mainland occupation would require. That's precisely the kind of asymmetric calculation that separates a genuinely credible, achievable military option from one that sounds dramatic in a headline, but doesn't actually survive contact with the real logistics and manpower math once serious military planners sit down and run the actual numbers. Let's talk about the human cost that's been driving this renewed pressure toward a ground option, because it's genuinely serious and deserves direct, careful attention rather than being treated as just another statistic buried inside a broader strike report. That same World Socialist website reporting states the Pentagon only acknowledged the scale of its losses on a Monday after days of refusal to do so, confirming nearly 100 soldiers had been wounded since July 7th alone. Chief Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell said the vast majority of those injuries were mild concussions, and that 96% of the wounded had already returned to duty. That same reporting states at least 20 American military and diplomatic sites had been hit by late June, according to a separate Wall Street Journal report, with Iranian attacks smashing structures at Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait, damaging Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, and destroying E-3 Sentry radar planes at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. Think about the political pressure a mounting casualty count like that creates for any administration prosecuting a war that was originally framed around quick, decisive airstrikes rather than a sustained, months-long campaign. Nearly 100 wounded American troops, 20 different military and diplomatic sites hit, and specialized, genuinely difficult-to-replace assets like E-3 Sentry radar aircraft destroyed. All of that accumulates into exactly the kind of sustained cost that historically pushes political leadership toward considering more decisive, if riskier, options, precisely the dynamic that appears to be driving renewed ground invasion discussions this specific summer. Consider what it actually means for a piece of hardware like an E-3 Sentry radar plane to be destroyed, because these aren't easily replaceable assets the way a standard fighter jet might be. The E-3 Sentry fleet is genuinely small, aging, and specialized, providing exactly the kind of airborne early warning and battle management capability that an entire regional air campaign depends on. Losing even a single one of these aircraft represents a meaningful degradation in overall coalition awareness and coordination capability, not simply a line item in a broader damage tally. That's precisely the kind of cumulative cost, small in any individual instance but genuinely serious in aggregate, that tends to erode political patience for a war that hasn't produced the quick, decisive resolution originally promised. And it's exactly the kind of pressure that pushes discussions toward more dramatic options like a ground operation, regardless of whether the underlying manpower math actually supports attempting one at full scale. Let's also talk about the earlier phase of this exact debate, back in the spring, because Trump's own public position on this question has genuinely shifted over time, and that evolution matters for understanding where things actually stand today. According to reporting from Malay Mail, back on March 6th, President Trump dismissed the idea of sending ground troops into Iran as, in his own words, a waste of time, telling NBC News that Iran had lost everything, lost its navy, lost everything it could possibly lose, and separately calling Iran's own foreign minister's warning about being ready for a ground invasion a wasted comment. But that early dismissal didn't hold for very long. According to reporting from The Mirror, citing NBC sourcing, Trump had privately shown what that reporting called serious interest in a chilling escalation of the war, discussing the idea of deploying ground troops with aides and Republican officials outside the White House. That same reporting includes an important clarification from White House officials, stating the president's remarks about potentially sending ground troops were not aimed at a full-scale military invasion of Iran, but instead centered on deploying a limited number of soldiers for specific targeted strategic objectives. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt pushed back directly on that reporting at the time, stating it was based on assumptions from anonymous sources who were not part of the president's national security team and were, in her words, clearly not read into these discussions. Think about the specific shape of that reported clarification for a moment, because it's genuinely consistent with everything else this video has already covered. Even when Trump was reportedly privately discussing ground troops with his own aides, the framing described wasn't a full-scale invasion. It was a limited number of soldiers for specific, targeted objectives, language that lines up almost precisely with Mackenzie's later public proposal to seize Kharg Island specifically, rather than anything resembling the kind of large-scale occupation Breedlove's own troop count comparison suggests simply isn't realistic, given the forces currently available in theater. Here's a hook worth sitting with. Trump's own public position moved from calling a ground invasion a waste of time in early March to privately discussing limited troop deployments with aides just weeks later, while his own press secretary was simultaneously pushing back on exactly how seriously to interpret those private discussions. That's not a stable, consistent policy position. That's the sound of an administration genuinely wrestling with a decision in real time, its internal deliberations occasionally leaking out faster than its public messaging could keep pace with. Let's talk about how the White House's official public messaging on this exact question evolved during that same window, because the specific wording chosen by officials matters enormously here. According to reporting from Fox News, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was asked directly, during the first press briefing after Operation Epic Fury launched, whether ground troops would be sent into Iran. Her response was carefully hedged. Ground troops, she said, were not part of the plan for this operation at that specific time, but, she added, she would certainly never take military options away from the president or commander-in-chief, and that he wisely does not do the same for himself. Think about the precision embedded in that specific answer, because it's a genuinely skillful piece of political language worth understanding in detail. Leavitt didn't say ground troops would never be used. She said they weren't currently part of the plan, a phrasing that leaves the door completely open for that plan to change at any future moment, while still technically avoiding a direct commitment either way. That's exactly the kind of deliberately ambiguous language an administration uses when it genuinely doesn't want to rule an option out, but also isn't ready to publicly commit to it either. Precisely the posture that's defined this entire 5-month debate from beginning to end. That same pattern of deliberately preserved ambiguity shows up again in later reporting too, reinforcing just how consistent this specific messaging strategy has actually been across the entire span of this war. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, published July 16th, President Trump refused to rule out sending U.S. troops into Iran as fighting resumed and strikes continued. A video report from that outlet, specifically examining what a U.S. ground invasion of Iran could actually involve, and the significant operational difficulties analysts say such an operation would likely pose for the American military. That reporting, landing more than 4 months after Leavitt's initial carefully hedged answer, shows the exact same underlying posture had persisted essentially unchanged across the entire intervening period. Never a firm commitment either way, never a permanent rule out, simply a consistently preserved option sitting on the table month after month as the broader war around it kept escalating. Think about what it means for that specific posture, neither confirming nor denying, neither committing nor ruling out, to remain essentially unchanged for more than 4 consecutive months of active warfare. That's not indecision in the ordinary sense of a leadership team simply struggling to make up its mind. It's a deliberate strategic choice to preserve maximum flexibility for as long as possible, keeping Iran's own military planners guessing about American intentions, while avoiding the domestic political costs that would come with either firmly committing to a ground invasion or publicly abandoning it as an option altogether. Whether that strategy actually works as intended, forcing Iran into costly hedging of its own defensive posture, or whether it simply reflects genuine internal disagreement within the administration about which path actually makes sense, is exactly the kind of question that may not have a clear answer until the war itself eventually reaches its conclusion. Let's pull this all together now, because I think the honest, complete answer to the question in this video's title is more nuanced and, frankly, more useful than either a simple yes or a simple no. Based on everything covered here, from the earliest March reporting through the most recent July developments, there is no fully confirmed, large-scale conventional ground invasion of Iran currently underway, in the sense most people would picture when they hear that specific phrase, tens of thousands of American troops crossing into Iranian territory to seize and hold ground the way the 2003 Iraq invasion unfolded. Retired General Breedlove's own force comparison makes clear that the troop numbers currently available in the region simply don't match that kind of operation, regardless of how seriously the political conversation around it has evolved. But it would be equally dishonest to claim nothing has actually happened on this front either. The 82nd Airborne has trained and deployed toward the region. The USS Tripoli arrived carrying 3,500 combat-capable Marines and sailors. The Pentagon, according to the Washington Post's own sourcing, was actively preparing for weeks of ground operations involving both special operations and conventional infantry raids. A retired four-star general who ran the entire Middle East theater has publicly called for seizing Kharg Island on national television. And the President of the United States has spent 5 straight months refusing to permanently rule out exactly this option, even while his own public statements have shifted from dismissing it outright to privately discussing it with his closest advisors. That specific combination, real force movements paired with consistently preserved ambiguity at the political level, is exactly what makes this question so genuinely difficult to answer with a simple headline. It's not nothing, and it's also not the full-scale invasion the title of this video might initially suggest to someone scrolling past it. It's something sitting deliberately and perhaps strategically in between those two extremes, and understanding that middle ground accurately matters considerably more than resolving it into whichever answer generates the most dramatic reaction. What do you think this actually means for where this war heads next? Do you think the force buildup and repeated internal deliberation covered throughout this video eventually crosses over into a genuine, large-scale ground operation? Or do you think the math Breedlove laid out, Iran's nearly 1 million total troops against America's 50,000 regional personnel, keeps this option limited to exactly the kind of targeted raids and island seizures Mackenzie specifically proposed, rather than anything resembling full invasion and occupation? Let me know where you land on this, because based on everything traced here, this specific question sits closer to the center of how this entire war actually resolves than almost anything else currently being discussed in the broader news cycle surrounding this conflict. One final thought before wrapping this up. The most responsible way to cover a claim this serious isn't to confidently declare it either completely true or completely false the moment it starts trending. It's to lay out exactly what's actually been confirmed, exactly what remains genuinely uncertain, and exactly what the honest gap between political rhetoric and battlefield reality actually looks like at this specific moment in an incredibly fast-moving war. A full ground invasion of Iran has not been confirmed to have begun as of the most recent reporting available, but this war has moved measurably, repeatedly, and consistently closer to that exact threshold with nearly every single week that's passed since it began, and that trajectory alone is worth taking every bit as seriously as a headline claiming the invasion has already started. Keep watching the specific signals covered throughout this video if you want to track where this actually heads next, rather than waiting for a single dramatic headline to settle the question for you. Watch troop and equipment movements more closely than official statements, because deployments are considerably harder to fully obscure than press briefing language. Watch whether retired officials like Mackenzie and Breedlove keep making public media appearances specifically advocating for or against a ground option, since that kind of public advocacy from people with real operational credibility tends to signal genuine internal debate happening behind closed doors. And watch whether the White House's own carefully hedged language ever actually shifts from options remain on the table towards something more definitive in either direction. Because that specific linguistic shift, more than almost anything else covered here, would be the clearest signal available that this 5-month debate has finally reached its resolution one way or the other. Sources used for verification, reference only, not part of the voiceover. Reuters via AOL. Pentagon preparing for weeks of ground operations in Iran. Washington Post reports. March 28, 2026. Special Operations, SOC, Conventional Infantry Raid Planning, Marine Deployment, 82nd Airborne Planning. New York Post, via AOL, Pentagon preparing for weeks of ground operations in Iran. 82nd Airborne Fort Bragg deployment imagery. March 13th. Marine Raid Detail News on Air. Iran's parliamentary speaker accuses U.S. secretly planning ground invasion. March 30th, 2026. USS Tripoli arrival, ADM. Brad Cooper meeting. Golubov quotes Britannica, 2026 Iran War. March 17th, limited invasion reference, Larijani killing, Zolghadr appointment, same date, broader war timeline. Wikipedia, 2026 Strait of Hormuz campaign. March 17th, GBU 72, bunkerbuster strike detail on same date World Socialist website. Former Trump envoy calls for ground invasion of Iran as U.S. losses mount. July 21st to 2026, Jenny Me. Mackenzie, Kharg Island advocacy, IISS troop estimates, casualty, toss-talk, site damage detail. World Socialist website, White House actively discussing sending ground troops to Iran. July 17th, 2026. Jenner and Breedlove force comparison. Mataki hostage-taking quote. Strike wave detail Malay mail, no boots on the ground. Trump says sending U.S. troops to Iran is a waste of time. March 6th, 2026. Trump's early dismissal, quote, The Mirror via AOL. Donald Trump has privately shown serious interest in chilling escalation of Iran war. Private ground troop discussion reporting. Levitt pushback, quote, Fox News. Levitt says ground troops in Iran not currently being considered, doesn't rule it out. March 4th, 2026. Official White House press briefing. Quote Fox News what a U.S. ground operation in Iran could look like as Pentagon preps for final phase. March 26, 2026. Targeted on short-duration mission framing. Expert risk assessment, Al Jazeera. What could a U.S. ground invasion of Iran look like? On July 16, 2026. Trump's refusal to rule out ground troops as fighting resumed. Please verify current developments before publishing, as this remains an extremely fast-moving and contested question. No source reviewed here confirms a large-scale conventional ground invasion has definitively begun, and claims to the contrary should be checked against the latest official Pentagon and CENTCOM statements.